la caída de Team Rumble, lo que hubo detrás, la historia detrás. Ya vimos más o menos lo que pasó con Crash Bandicoot 5. De hecho, vamos a ver quizás un poco más de cosas y cómo quizás esté conectado con lo que pasó con Team Rumble y su muerte prematura. Todo F.
Of 2020
Ya, este es un escenario de Team Rumble. Los primeros conceptos de Team Rumble. Oh, gente. Bueno, yo siempre me emociono cuando veo un escenario, la verdad. No hay escenario con el que no me emocione. Siempre me emociono. ¿Por qué mentir? ¿Verdad? El video está en inglés, así que aprendan a leer.
Crash 4's launch, the project was being second-guessed altogether. Since 2018, Toys for Bob had gone back and forth on whether Wumpa League would be released as an add-on or a standalone game. By the time...
¡Era el puente! Chat, eso era el primer mapa del Rumble. Era el neón del puente, vean. Los primeros conceptos. Es igual. Es igual, yo referencia. No soy furro escroto con piojos.
Primero que nada, pudrete Activision, vengo llegando y me reciben con cosas sad pipipi. ¿Qué tal Carlitos? ¿Cómo estás? Y Holly gente del YouTube, espero que estén genial, no como el Crashito pipipi,
Oiga, no le diga así, se llama así literalmente, escroto con piojos. Bueno, gracias por los 60 bitsazos. Muy buen compa el piojos. Y si el Crash... No, triste.
Crash 4 vendió mal porque salió en una época de mierda, octubre del PBTO 2020, además tuvo que pelear con el glorioso Pikmin 3, FIFA 21, un juego de Transformers, y la wea esa del Genshin.
Él deseó Genshin. Guyus tenía razón. Y dudamos de él. Bueno, sigamos viendo, chat.
Game. By the time Crash 4 was finished, there was still some uncertainty around this. In the end, Activision wasn't interested in either, and shot down their proposal to put it into full production.
O sea, esto, Team Rumble, inicialmente era Wumpa League, como siempre lo habíamos conocido, pero era un multijugador gratuito parte de Crash 4. Obviamente muy diferente a lo que acabó siendo al final. Quizás tenía menos personajes, yo qué sé. Luego algo pasó y vamos a ver qué pasó.
Sending them back to the drawing board.
Activision no gustó esto y lo canceló. Ya DCT que si quieres cambiar el idioma de tu Insanity tienes que cambiar el idioma de la consola.
Vengo a renovar mi sub, ahora solo desapareceré entre el chat.
Gracias Eric, supongo. Nos vemos.
Ex-developers indicated that the publisher had lost confidence in it, motivated at least in part by early Crash 4 sales numbers. By the time it was halted, a considerable amount of progress had been made on it.
Pero vean, hay un montón de contenido de Team Rumble nuevo que están mostrando que no mostraron antes, ¿no? Este mapa se me hace conocido. Creo que este es el mapa inicial tóxico que vimos ya en el juego final. Creo.
Had been made on it. A variety of different character movesets had been built, and dozens of skins practically finished. As October 2020 went on, the company's heads believed that they would have a better chance of justifying its existence to Activision Blizzard if it became linked to other properties they owned. As such, they drew plans to revamp the Wumpa League as a crossover multiplayer game centered around an all-star lineup of Blizzard icons. This quickly morphed into being focused solely on World of Warcraft characters like Thrall and Uther the Lightbringer, all of which were reimagined in a cartoony art style akin to the studio's previous works. It was intended to have a sense...
querían hacer un Rumble con Warcraft. Chana, gracias por la sub con Prime. Imagina a Astral, a Arta, esperante con el Crash.
Tal vez, no sé por qué no puedo confirmarlo. También influyó en algo que el Trilogy era un juego que iba a la segura con 3 juegos conocidos y muy queridos. En cambio con el 4 la gente esperó un poco para las reseñas y vieron que era súper frustrante.
Sí, es que para el pobre Crashito, al Mario le va bien porque es un juego muy accesible y luego puede poner cosas difíciles. Pero el Crash apenas empiezas, ¡toma mierda! Te destruye. Te la mete por todos lados y no te enteras. Muy complicado el juego. Vale, está normal, ¿no? ¿Te imaginas que con la compra de Microsoft hubiéramos visto al jefe maestro en Team Rumble? El Team Rumble era el Smash en 3D. Metían al jefe maestro ahí peleando y metían a Rayman. Rayman es de Ubisoft, ¿no? ¿Quién carajo podía entrar? ¿Banjo-Kazooie? No sé quién es esta en Microsoft. En Xbox. Me falta cultura. ¿Jak and Daxter estaba ahí?
Was intended to have essentially
Conker.
the same gameplay style as Wumpa League.
¿Te imaginas a Arta saltando por las tablas de madera de Crash? Este mapa se ve increíble. ¿Cuánto plataformeo?
Extraño el piano TDYU Pet.
Yo también.
A competitive multiplayer platformer. Developers who were privy to this pitch said that internally there was limited enthusiasm for this shakeup, but it would prove ultimately short-lived. Blizzard had no interest in this alternate take on their franchise and shot down the idea towards the end of October.
Blizzard le temió al éxito, no quiso prestar, o bueno, no quiso entrarle a que sus personajes estuvieran ahí. Y eso que Activision tiene a Blizzard también. Que venga Blizzard, pero...
In the weeks that followed, Toys for Bob attempted to salvage some of their work by again
¿Cómo hizo un dash para arriba pero especial? Ven ese Cortex.
weeks that
Ven abajo a la derecha, sus poderes. Tenía 4. Bueno, también tienen 4 en el juego final, ¿no?
followed, Toys for Bob attempted to salvage some of their work by again repurposing the bones of the project. In November 2020, they developed a pitch for what could have been their first original property since Skylanders, which was called Monster Mechs. This was planned to be an online multiplayer game about small creatures who would pilot mech suits to do battle. Players could collect different parts like arms, legs, and chest armor, and create their own mech by combining together the pieces they liked best. This endeavor lasted only a few weeks before being rejected by Activision, who was not interested in funding it. Then,
Pobre Toys for Bob, todo le cancelaban. Ya van 3 seguiditas: Crash 5, el Team Rumble inicial, bueno, Goomba League, este juego. Todo mal.
6 weeks after Crash Bandicoot 4 launched, the axe fell on its planned sequel.
No, luego de 6 meses lo cancelaron definitivamente Crashito 5. Ya, o lo entendí mal. Luego de 6 meses, lean la partida aquí.
Then, 6 weeks after Crash Bandicoot 4 launched, the axe fell on its planned sequel. Its developers had hoped to transition into full production in the near future, building upon what they had learned from both Crash 4 and the Spyro Reignited trilogy to take their work to new heights. Despite an extensively mapped out plan, Activision was not willing to move forward with it.
Oh, sí van a hacer un mapa interconectado. No, niveles separados. Esto lo confirma. No, chat. Era Toy Sanity 2. Era Toy Sanity 2. Activision, dicen. 6 semanas después. Vaya tiempo, ¿no?
November 2020, Crash Bandicoot 5 was cancelled. The publisher was, in general, pulling back from producing big-budget single-player games at the time, and had turned down a number of such pitches from their other subsidiaries, including new Tony Hawk titles. Instead, they wanted to focus on multiplayer franchises using the games-as-a-service model, which had proven financially successful. The initial sales figures for Crash 4 only spurred them on further in this direction. In the aftermath of Crash 5's cancellation, there were brief talks about combining their Crash Spyro crossover and multiplayer concepts together, but for the time being, Project Lava was effectively shelved. As Toys for Bob's projects were shut down, Activision decided that they would begin to work primarily on providing support for future Call of Duty releases.
¡Vamos, que no te ha vuelto! Como Toy for Bob lanzó como 4 proyectos para que pudiera trabajar, todo le cancelaron. Sale su codcito. Los subtítulos son rápidos. Tienes que leer un poco más rápido, compañera.
They joined around 3,000 other people across various studios around the world that were working on the franchise at the time. Amid this reshuffling, numerous employees expressed their profound disappointment to me about this turn of events. The making of Crash 4 and Wumpa League by all accounts had a scrappy, improvisational quality to it.
TQMTDYU chispas.
Abigail, y muchas gracias por los 10 bits y por el mensaje, se aprecia bastante. Bueno, los empleados obviamente estaban molestos, no les gustaba trabajar para COD, querían hacer Crash, chicos. Guyus es el villano de una historia mal contada, siempre tuvo la razón. Chat, desde ahora, ustedes deben disculparse con Guyus. Yo apenas lo conocí, yo dije, Guyus es el mejor. Confíen en él, nuestro general. Perdónanos por todo, Guyus, ahora fue Activision. Guyus era el villano de una historia mal contada. Te perdono por todo, Guyus. Mierda, estamos hablando, ¿ve? Autorizo que el general Guyus controle mi mente.
A lot of room for experimentation, with ideas regularly in flux. By the time Crash 5 came around, the developers had honed their process, and had a much stronger sense of direction going into it. They had learned a lot from the last game, and with that experience came a newfound sense of confidence that they would be able to improve upon those foundations.
Vean, otro arte de Crash 5 que no llegamos a ver, bueno, del supuesto Crash 5. Una base completamente en llamas de Uka Uka. Quizás esta era la mente de Uka Uka, y no el castillo morado que vimos antes. Fuentes de fuego, Dios, esto era otro hub. ¿Saben? Si el juego no hubiera sido cancelado de Crash 5, lo tendríamos hoy. Ahora.
Guyus de Raptor siempre fue bueno. Activision y TDYU malos TDYUWIN.
Hubieran empezado en 2020, y estamos en 2024. Lo tendríamos este año seguramente, son 4 años de desarrollo. Bueno, 3, porque estaba acabando también 2020. No, y tendríamos buen lore del Crash. ¿Cómo pasa el tiempo?
But they were ultimately denied the chance to prove that. In the months after, a number of developers from Crash 4 began to leave the studio, some of which were disillusioned by the fate of its sequel and completely opposed to working on Call of Duty.
Oh, se fueron todos los... No, gente. La caída del Nintendo de Crash 5.
According to several people I spoke to. Josh Nadelberg, the art director behind the Spyro Reignited trilogy and Crash 4, departed the company in February 2021. Jan Steck, Crash 4's lead designer, left in March 2021. Nick Livingston, the studio's longtime executive producer, who'd been there since 2006, left in May 2021. All three of these, incidentally, went to work.
O sea, los principales de Crash y de Spyro se fueron. Los que estaban dentro de Toys for Bob.
For Phoenix Labs, a Vancouver-based developer known for games like Dauntless and Fae Farm. Despite the reality of the situation, rumors began to...
Pero regresó el director de arte de Crash 4 a TFB. Bueno, Toys for Bob ahora es independiente. Y ahora regresó uno de ellos, ¿en serio? Hoy sería God. Vamos, vamos, Toys for Bob, ustedes pueden. Bueno, ya. Ahora sacan Skylander, ¿saben qué chucha me importa?
to percolate around this time that Toys for Bob was developing a new Spyro game. This was based almost solely on the official art book for Crash Bandicoot 4. Page 252 of the book contains art of the Snacks Dimension, one of the later worlds from the game. In this image, a building with a statue of Spyro can be seen, with his name beneath it. The artist responsible for this illustration, Bronk Crows, wrote a short paragraph describing his work. Quote, "It was fun to combine Dingo's Diner with the futuristic element, to have those cars with the city below, and a little hint at Spyro. Many fans took..."
Ya ven, les dije, esa cosa de Spyro 4 era un easter egg, estaba en los planes.
This to mean that Toys for Bob was teasing a new Spyro title, leading to a number of news outlets picking up the story. One site,
O no, o me tiro bait.
GameReactor.eu, even went as far as using the headline Spyro 4 all but confirmed. Regardless of all this hype, Toys for Bob was not working on Spyro 4 at the time, nor
¡Era bait! No, bueno, Spyro 4 no existía, ¿no?
was this image teasing anything. I confirmed this after contacting Bronk Crows, the artist behind the piece, who told me that it wasn't a hint at a new game at all.
¡Broma! Spyro 4 del Crash 5, dicen.
He was a freelancer who worked on the project via an external outsourcing studio for art and was not directed by Toys for Bob or Activision to add Spyro. It was entirely his decision. He had no knowledge of any new Spyro project and simply included it as a nod towards a character he liked. Spyro is referenced in Easter eggs throughout Crash 4, and the
Bromita, bromita, no cambia nada.
Broma.
Spyro building seen in the art book doesn't even appear in the actual game. In reality, it was nothing more than one artist having fun with their assignment. Toys for Bob, by all accounts, gave artists a lot of room for self-expression and allowed them to put their stamp on their work. For instance, an artist named Brett Bean would sometimes depict Wumpa Fruit as living beings in his sketches. Through the first months of 2021,
O sea, no podemos tomar todos los artes de forma literal, porque los artistas tenían libertad creativa, como las jumpas vivientes. Curioso.
Most of Toys for Bob staff worked on content for Call of Duty Warzone, while a small group completed development on the Switch, next-gen and PC versions of Crash 4. In the absence of an original project of their own being commissioned, their management attempted to keep as many of their staff employed as they could by picking up additional support work on Overwatch 2 for Blizzard. They did this in the hope that they would get to go back to larger original projects with as much of the Crash 4 team intact as possible.
Oh, qué triste. O sea, la de Toys for Bob, varios renunciaron, pero varios también querían quedarse para tener la esperanza de volver a crear un juego propio ellos y no ser un soporte nomás. Hasta las últimas se quedaban ahí, dándolo todo, chicos.
However, multiple ex-workers have since told me that the experience of working with Blizzard on Overwatch 2 was miserable, citing an impersonal management style and an unclear creative direction that often fluctuated on a whim. Some even told me that being put on Call of Duty felt like a punishment from Activision for failing to live up to their expectations. One former developer provided the following comment on Activision's treatment of Toys for Bob's workers at the time. Quote, The idea that the team that had been built at Toys for Bob would be an appropriate team to work on Call of Duty was just completely off. At that moment, it was clear that Activision just did not care about who we were, what we did, whether or not we were a good fit for it. They didn't really care who we were as a studio or as a team. Towards the start of 2021, Toys
Tan feos se sentían los desarrolladores de T for Bob.
A final de cuentas eso es una chamba y debemos acostumbrarnos a decirles adiós a varias franquicias hechas con amor pero girando en torno a negocio pues no es rentable. TDYU Pentasat.
Sí, básicamente. Entonces podríamos decir que Activision una vez vio que T for Bob no cumplió las expectativas con Crash 4, lo pusieron de soporte y medio que lo estaban tratando, según ellos, ¿no? Ellos mismos, como cualquier cosa, para que quizás renunciaran por su cuenta como pasó con varios. No lo sé.
Debería ser un caso de estudio en la carrera de Game Dev como el Crash pasó de ser el Mario Bros. De PlayStation a una franquicia olvidada que ni sus dueños le tienen fe.
Chat. ¿Y si algún día Crash se va a Nintendo? No. Nintendo sí lo salvaría. Bueno, por ahora Crash no se sabe cómo está. Puede ser que estén haciendo otra cosa y no nos demos cuenta. Puede ser, no lo sé. Realmente no lo sé.
Toys for Bob was not able to find enough support work to keep all of their developers together, and had to begin letting people go. Later, on April 29th of that same year, Toys for Bob shared on their social media that they were supporting the development of Call of Duty Warzone.
T for Bob está orgulloso de ayudar al desarrollo de la Season 3 de Call of Duty, Warzone. Y según el youtuber dice que estaban completamente decepcionados. ¡Qué mentira, wey! Y todos renunciando ahí, las cabezas.
Season 3.
Sabes, luego de escuchar todo esto, me siento feliz que a Activision le está yendo de la patada, con la filtración de su nuevo COD, la plaga de hackers en el Warzone y su baja de jugadores consecutivos. Desde lo más hondo de mi corazón.
Pero
Se jodan Pride Pog.
Pero si están haciendo otro Crash 5 ahorita, nos quedamos como payasos.
Crash está igual o más muercero que Satoru jajajaja TDYUWIN.
¿Ustedes se imaginan que...
Pues, ¿qué te digo? Su fuente de oro es Mario, es como el caso de Banjo en Xbox, que tiene, no cambia nada ahí está para que acumule polvo.
Bueno, Banjo Kazooie. Y si ustedes se imaginan que Activision le dijo que T4 no hiciera Crash 5 y se lo pasó a otra empresa, bueno, es que no conocemos a otra. Vinox, Ricardo Vincent está muerto también ya. No sé quiénes más quedan, no creo. ¿Qué dice Tadeo? Ahora mañana mismo Activision saca ¡pum! Trailer Crash 5. ¡Mierda! Pero otro, no, obviamente este no. Alpha Dream, Monkey Games. ¡Locura! Fue un diseñador muy bueno.
This prompted numerous developers to come forward, revealing that they were no longer employed by the company. One of these was Blake Malone.
Y el creador es Guyus, dice. Hemos encontrado al mayor fan de Crash, dicho por él, y creemos que él va a revivir la franquicia, la esencia original.
De la nada aparece crossover épico en el Sparkling Zero haciendo canon el Crash mayor que Goku.
Demostrando. Guyus, el nuevo juego de Guyus es el Crash 5. Él nos lo decía y no lo podíamos ver.
Blake Maloof, a designer who had worked there for over a decade, who tweeted, quote, "I no longer work at Toys for Bob," with a crying emoji. Another person to speak out about the...
¿Qué? Me distrajeron.
Maloof, a designer who had worked there for over a decade, who tweeted, quote, "I no longer work at Toys for Bob," with a crying emoji. Another person to speak out about the situation was Nicholas Cole, a character designer who had served there since 2017. He said it was, quote, "the end of an era," and that everyone he had interfaced
Desde el fondo de mi alma y de mis viseras, maldito seas pueblo de Is. Digo Activision.
Activision, dicen. Mira, aquí nos están spoileando que T4 iba ya por mal camino, ¿no? O sea, ellos estaban todo el tiempo por estos años intentando trabajar en un proyecto propio y no ser solo soporte, pero no podían. Yo creo que se fue al vacío Crash, como en la serie de Loki.
And worked alongside had been let go. Furthermore, when asked if Toys for Bob was only working on Call of Duty at the time, Cole replied simply, "Yep."
¡No! Aquí nos confirmó, lo vimos aquí todo el tiempo y no lo supimos apreciar. Espérense, ¿y Team Rumble? O sea, durante 2021 y 20 no hicieron nada de Team Rumble. Porque Team Rumble salió en 2023.
GameIndustry.biz reported on the story, and one day later Activision reached out to them, attempting to change the narrative around the situation. Quote,
La Voltis, bueno, lo intento. Ayer algún palic, pues.
Reports of layoffs at Toys for Bob are incorrect. There has not been a reduction in personnel recently at the studio. The development team is operating fully and has a number of full-time job openings at this time. The studio is excited to continue supporting Crash Bandicoot 4 It's About Time, and more recently provide additional development support to Call of Duty Warzone. The statement was worded fairly nebulously. For instance, the line, "There has not been a reduction in personnel recently at the studio," which carefully avoided establishing the exact period of time they were
Recientemente. O sea, en las recientes horas no ha habido reducción de personal. Ah, pero hace 3 días. Ay.
referring to. This statement was
Por decir algo, ¿no?
issued in April, and the people affected were let go towards the start of the year. Technically, there were no layoffs at Toys for Bob around this time, as they said, but neither Nicholas Cole or any other employees ever claimed otherwise. With all that said, their claim that there was no reduction in personnel was clearly false. Many of Toys for Bob's workers at the time were there on a contract basis. These people worked for them full time and did essentially the same amounts of work expected from people in permanent positions, but got paid less and had fewer benefits, as I've mentioned. Activision, like many other publishers, uses contract work as a cost-cutting measure. In the first months of 2021, as Toys for Bob was unable to secure enough work for them, a number of people did not have their contracts renewed, and so they were let go.
En otras palabras, o en resumen lo que acaba de decir, no hubo despidos, sino acabó el contrato y no hubo renuevo, básicamente. O propusieron, pero con menos beneficios, al final no aceptaron, básicamente. Pero bueno, así es la vida, chicos. Así es la vida. Si tu jefe no te quiere más y busca una mejor alternativa según ellos, es lo que hay. Puede ser que haya pasado eso y no lo sepamos, ¿ah? A lo mejor Crash 5, Activision dijo, estoy pensando como ellos, ¿ok? O intentando pensar como ellos. Crash tiene potencial, pero Crash 4 no vendió como yo quería. Puede ser que Toys for Bob sea la culpa, entonces pasemos Crash 5 no para ti, sino tu empresa nueva. Haz tu Crash 5, ya no confío en ellos. Y ustedes váyanse. Así, algo así. Y ahora se está cocinando uno. Pensando con algo de fe del Crash, igual es por Toys for Bob, pero bueno, así es la vida. Pero no es Activision, es Factivision. No romanticen Activision. Yo estoy que solamente digo algo que puede haber pasado.
This mostly impacted the company's art department, which was heavily reduced, although people in other roles like designers were affected too. Some of these contractors had been there for over half a decade, going back as far as the Skylanders days. Out of the former developers I spoke to, for them getting their contract renewed every several months was just a formality. They had no expectation that they were going to be let go. Generally, most people would not define those as layoffs, but the effect is very similar. To say that there was no reduction in personnel was simply not truthful, hence why Nicholas Cole, for example, said that everyone he interfaced with had been let go. As for their claim that Toys for Bob would continue supporting Crash Bandicoot 4, that didn't turn out to be accurate either. Toys for Bob did not work on any additional content or even patches for it after this statement was made. For some of the contractors I spoke to, this
Crash 4 no tuvo ninguna utilización luego de ese comentario, o sea, mintieron. O estaban trabajando en algo y no lo sacaron nunca. Igual que más le podían meter. Bueno, parches para arreglar bugs. El truco de la F, lo parcharon.
saga was a last twist of the knife from an organization that often made them feel less valued than full-time workers, despite the substantial contributions they made to the games they worked on. An example pointed out to me by former employees of how little Activision valued these workers can be found in the credit sequences of Crash Bandicoot 4 and the Spyro Reignited trilogy. In both games, the pets belonging to full-time staffers at Toys for Bob received a higher billing in the credits than their contracted art team. I spoke to a number of these former contractors, one of whom offered this comment, quote, "I love the people at Toys for Bob. There were individuals there that did their best to make us feel part of the team. But as an organization, Activision or Toys for Bob, wherever the buck stopped, it was made clear that we were considered ultimately pretty disposable by the end." Throughout the remainder of 2021, the studio's main assignment was contributing to Call of Duty Warzone and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Partway into the year, however, their management resumed exploring ways for them to do their own original projects. From these discussions emerged the idea to reboot Project Lava once more and attempt to rework it into something Activision would be willing to greenlight.
Chicos, Aquí es cuando inicia la resurrección del Crashito Rumble. Bueno, el inicio de Wumpa League.
As opposed to being an update for Crash 4, Lava was revived as a budget standalone spin-off game catered to Activision sensibilities. It would be a live service multiplayer title with a seasonal battle pass system that would be built primarily from recycled Crash 4 assets and would require little R&D due to the extensive amount already done on Wumpa League. While that iteration of the project had fully original worlds, this new game would consist of stages based around levels from Crash 4, like Rude Awakening and Insanity Peak. This approach would make it cost-effective and relatively quick to develop. Crash 4 had
Entonces le dieron luz verde al Team Rumble porque justamente iba a costar muy poco. Iban a reusar todo lo de Crash 4 y por eso ya Activision, dale, si no vamos a gastar nada, perfecto, tú mismo eres. Pero el plan original era hacer un montón de cosas, como vimos antes.
Resurrección, pero si desde el primer tráiler terminaron de enterrarlo TDYU Rage.
Lo que cuando tú quieras golpe, ¿verdad? Aparte, Crashito Rumble iba a ser mucho mejor. CT Rumble nació muerto por culpa de Activision. Team Rumble fue rushado. La madre, pobre Team Rumble. Pero si está basado, Rumble God, Aleje está basado.
had since been released on more platforms like Nintendo Switch and PC, these ports strengthened sales numbers, helping to alleviate concerns about the viability of the IP.
Claro, Crash 4 luego vendió mucho mejor y con PC y Switch también vendió mucho más. Entonces Activision tuvo fe una vez más en Crash. Salió el Rumble y le fue horrible.
Activision, tú dale Roberto, tú solo contra el mundo como Left 4 Dead TDYU Cocoja.
No, Activision. Y el Rumble no está ni en Switch, que hubiera funcionado mejor.
Strengthened sales numbers, helping to alleviate concerns about the viability of the IP. Activision approved of their new concept, setting in motion the game that would eventually come to be known as Crash Team Rumble. While a lot of the relatively small studio continued providing support for Call of Duty, the remainder worked on Rumble. The game's ambitions were vastly scaled back from what was proposed with Wumpa League. Not only were plans for fully original locations dropped, the levels in Rumble were generally much smaller arena-type environments than those built for its prior iteration. Due to this downside,
mucho más pequeño, cosas conocidas, a la cosa enorme que era antes, que parecía hasta un Battle Royale. Bueno, tampoco tanto. Oh, shit.
The parachute mechanic that had previously enabled players to glide around its expansive environments was dropped entirely, although the game retained the backpacks that once housed them as unlockable cosmetics. The idea of having multi-tiered skins that would evolve as players leveled them up was stripped out too, in another example of budget trimming. Rumble also abandoned the concept of having other types of fruits scattered throughout levels. While melons were removed entirely, the idea behind bananas, pads players had to stand on to capture, was reworked into gems. These functioned essentially the same, but would provide a temporary boost to the amount of Wumpa fruit banked by a team if they managed to activate a full set of gem pads. Another old idea that made a return was the Wumpa whale.
¡La ballena, chat!
Previously, this was a
Vean, antes teníamos las cajas activadoras. O sea, más elementos, ¿cómo se llama? El Crashito en forma de mecánicas. Ni modo, que son otros 10 años sin Crash. Y Manol, no lo sabemos. No lo sabemos. ¿Quién sabe lo que puede pasar? Confía.
Previously, this was a stage element players could ride on to amass Wumpa, but in Rumble it was reimagined as its own mode. Players had to collect relics from around stages and bring them to a bank to summon the Wumpa whale. The team to successfully bring about the whale would rapidly gain Wumpa, while the opposing team would have to frighten the creature off by collecting rubber ducks. The whale in the final game maintained the low-poly appearance of the model used during the prototyping phase. This game type was experimented with throughout Crash Team Rumble's run, appearing occasionally as a limited time mode. While the developers
Al final, en los últimos intentos de Team Rumble por sobrevivir, metieron como 10 mods de juego al toque, ¿no? Y uno, el de la hora disco, que fue increíble, solamente lo metieron una vez. Y luego murió.
had considered including story content of some kind during Wumpa League, Rumble did away with that notion altogether and was focused solely on a multiplayer experience. The only
¿Cómo?
with throughout Crash Team Rumble's run, appearing occasionally as a limited time mode. While the developers had considered including story content of some kind during Wumpa League,
Tenían pensado meter modo historia. Pero
Rumble did away with that notion altogether and was focused solely on a multiplayer experience.
Lo tenían pensado, al menos. Locura. Como en el Bash. ¿Qué iban a contar? No lo sé. Como en el Bash, dicen.
The only hint of any narrative elements existed outside the game itself. Alongside each seasonal update, Toys for Bob released a short webcomic introducing...
Bueno, Ataque dice que había modo historia fuera del juego, sí, en los cómics, ¿no? Supongo que esas cosas que estamos viendo en los cómics lo veríamos jugable. Yo qué sé. De hecho, ¿recuerdan la parte de Cat Bat? Ya les decía. Esa parte de Cat Bat donde va con sus bichos a vengarse de Cortex y su castillo propio. Sería algo muy guapo jugable. Eso fue lo que dije en su momento.
Confirmado, Team Rumble era Crash Bash Remake. Como siempre la idea era buena, la ejecución con las nalgas TDYUFlojo Rage.
Es muy diferente el juego, pero bueno. Supongo que... No, yo que sí. Supongo que las historias iban a contar el origen de cada personaje o algo así. Bueno, origen, solamente mi personaje nuevo. No sé, no sé.
Each new character. These comics were illustrated by Nicolas Saviori, who had previously worked at Toys for Bob on Spyro, Crash 4, and Rumble's earlier incarnations. The first of these told the backstory of Catbat, a character originally imagined for Wumpa League who was revealed to have been an escaped experiment of Cortex's with a passion for rock music. Catbat would, in the end, be the only original character to be carried over from Wumpa League to Crash Team Rumble. For some former Toys for Bob workers, seeing Wumpa League be reworked into a new scaled-back form was a bittersweet experience. Here's what one of them had to say about that. Quote, I think Rumble was fun, but Rumble was a skeleton of what it was intended to be in the end.
Un esqueleto, o sea, básicamente nada comparado a lo que tenían pensado en un principio.
Very few assets were created originally for Rumble. It was all asset reuse from the games we did create. Very, very little of what was intended to be the multiplayer project actually survived. But the core of the gameplay loop I actually thought was still fun. I just feel like all around you could sense that it was not given the full love and attention it would have gotten had it been developed as a serious product. While Toys for Bob was quietly pitching their revival of Project Lava in mid-2021, speculation around the Wumpa League reached a fever pitch. Although that iteration of the project was effectively no more by this point, it was widely believed to still be coming. This was largely down to two different factors. Assets from Wumpa League were discovered inside Crash 4, and the fact...
Bien, ese mapa, o sea, ese mapa es como 4 veces más grande de lo que tiene al final el juego. Bueno, tampoco tanto, 3 veces más grande de los mapas originales ya de Team Rumble. Juegas bien, saludazos. Y tiene puentes del Crash,
Lo único que fue cabra fue el minijuego de disco y disco Cortex TDYUMRAGE.
Ese minijuego estaba muy bueno. Mod de Minecraft. Y ese Spyro paracaídas.
Crash 4, and the fact that a piece of official marketing material had referenced Wumpa League by name. Back at the end of November 2020, after Wumpa League had stopped
Le faltó esencia.
development, the official Crash Bandicoot social media accounts released an advertisement paying homage to the Uncharted series. In this clip, Crash and Coco are seen playing Uncharted 4, a nod to a scene from that game in which Nathan Drake and Elena Fisher play the original Crash Bandicoot. This video primarily served as an advertisement for Crash 4 going into the holiday season, but it also included a small teaser for the once-planned Wumpa League. As the camera pulls away from Crash and Coco, a sign spelling out the words Wumpa League can be seen in the distance.
Bueno, hacia aquí el primer vistazo de Wumpa League, aunque al final este Wumpa League se canceló. Team Rumble es otra cosa.
I spoke to an Activision source who revealed that this video was locked in months before being posted. Regardless, it would lead to lasting confusion as rumours and speculation ran rampant throughout 2021. A number of different theories gained traction over this period, the most prominent of which baselessly claimed that Wumpa League was a party game linked to the PS1 spin-off title Crash. Further fuel was dumped onto the fire by Toys for Bob themselves during an August 2021
Bueno, aquí también estamos viendo cosas que ya vimos antes, ¿no? Para no meter relleno. O sea, pensamos que era Crash Bash, en esta exposición aquí salía Wumpa League, metían 1000 pistas, también lo pusieron en el State of Play, para que ya meter cosas que ya sabemos. Sí. Ah, y en el 2021, en el aniversario de Crash Bandicoot, estas dos personas dijeron en un video especial por el aniversario que estamos felices por Crash, todo lo que tú quieran, y que esperen por más noticias. O sea, que se vendrán cositas. Sí. Por el 25 aniversario.
In December of 2021, this would lead to the official Twitter account for the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire tweeting a poll which asked, "For real, where is Wumpa League?"
Pero pasaron los meses y no había nada y todo el mundo preguntando, ¿qué es Wumpa League? ¿Dónde está Wumpa League? Muerto. Lo que más ganó. No, nunca existió, dice. Esto fue en 2021, ¿eh? Terrible. Basados. Sí, sí, bueno, uy, espérate, esto es importante, creo.
Whereas its former iteration Wumpa League was no more by this point, Project Lava was very much alive, quietly under development at Toys for Bob, although it would be another 12 months before fans would get to see it. While Toys for Bob projects before it had utilised outsourcing as standard practice, Crash Team Rumble leaned on it slightly more heavily. Due to their art department being reduced considerably in 2021, external companies like Airborne...
¡Híjole!
Crash 4 salió incompleto, lo de ahí iban a hacer una ensalada en Wumpa League que ni salió y de ahí hicieron otra ensalada. Eso fue Rumble para colmo, pague 900 pesos por el deluxe TDYU Pentasat.
¿Pero te maté con un piano o no? Soy Logan. O pues yo la verdad me la pasaba muy bien con Team Rumble. Lo amo. ¿Qué le pasa? Gracias por los 32 pizzazos. Sacar todo ese tal cáncer es muy fuerte. La deluxe todavía.
To their art department being reduced considerably in 2021, external companies like Airborne Studios in Germany were contracted to pick up the slack. Airborne had previously worked on both Crash 4 and Wumpa League, but their contribution...
Por ejemplo, ese concepto, chat. ¿Un nivel que nunca salió a la luz? ¿O solo se quedó en concepto? Este es de Crash 4, este no es de Crash 5, este es de Crash 4. Uy, se ve muy guapo.
Wumpa League, but their contribution to Rumble was slightly more extensive. They helped to realise stages for the game and a multitude of different skins for characters. Over the course of development, the core team continued to experiment with ideas for how those skins would be doled out, and how monetization around the game would function. At one point, they considered having a premium currency that could be purchased with real money called Wumpa Bucks. In the end, they chose a Battle Pass system, and Wumpa Bucks were reworked into Crash Coins.
¿Debería hacer un video de Crash 5 yo? No, ¿para qué, no? La verdad, hace tiempo extraño hacer videos así, en vez de puros retos y ya está. Ya vimos en verdad todo, ¿no? O sea, si yo hablo de Crash 5, mostraré las artes y hablaré un poco de ellos, de la historia que nos ha dicho este tipo. No sé si hay información por otra parte. Solo dirás huevadas. Gracias, chicos. Gracias.
A currency introduced in Crash Team Rumble Season 2 that could be spent to skip tiers of the Battle Pass without playing. The game would ultimately be set for a June 2023 release. In the meantime, fans would endure a year of false theories and hoaxes, suggesting it would appear at Summer Games Fest, Gamescom, and other events. It was eventually announced in December 2022 at the Game Awards, wherein a Crash Bandicoot mascot rappelled down onto the stage to present its debut trailer. The unveiling brought to a close 2 solid years of speculation following the initial Wumpa League teasers in late 2020. It was set for release on PS4, PS5, Xbox One, and Xbox Series consoles. In the following months, advertising around it was sparse, with...
Sí, esta huevada afectó bastante. Apenas hubo publicidad para Team Rumble, o sea, los Activision ni siquiera se esforzaron en el marketing para apoyar al pobre Team Rumble. Hay gente que ni siquiera se enteró. Yo estuve ahí, chat. ¿Quiénes estuvieron en la beta conmigo en el Team Rumble? Y tampoco explicaron bien de qué iba el juego. Nos enteramos tarde. O sea, yo estaba ahí metido y ni siquiera sabía durante los primeros meses.
Only occasional details trickling out through press previews. It was revealed that the game would receive both standard and deluxe editions. The standard version, which was digital only, was sold for $30 or £25 in the UK, whereas the deluxe retailed for $40 or £35 and was available both physically and digitally. The standard included a premium battle pass for the first season, while the deluxe had premium battle passes for seasons 1 and 2, the option to instantly unlock the first 25 tiers of season 1's battle pass.
Bueno, ¿qué te explicando el juego? No quiero saber explicarte el juego. Sí, ya sabemos todo lo que tenía. Sí. Ya vimos todo lo que pasó. Oh, espérate, aquí pasa algo.
Some involved in the
Mira, aquí Toys for Bob planeó un flujo
stream of new content lasting
en contenido nuevo que duraría un año.
at least 1 year after launch.
Al menos un año.
But according to some involved in the development, Activision was already pulling back on their support for it before it was even released.
Ya la estaban matando. Ya le estaban quitando apoyo antes de que saliera. Mierda. Pero David quería que saliera Team Rumble. O sea, su propia empresa. Los estaban abandonando sin antes salir. Activision no confiaba. Ni Blizzard. Tenían razón. Fue Activision, te odio. Ok, no.
Around the launch of Crash Team Rumble, an
Sí, la predicción.
outsourced studio that had been working closely with Activision on the game was told that their services would no longer be required. This came as a surprise to those involved who had previously been under the impression they would be working on the game into the indefinite future. Crash Team Rumble was finally released on the 20th of June 2023 and received mixed reviews from critics, landing an average score of 67 on Metacritic. Many praised its core gameplay loop while criticizing its monetization and progression systems. Sales for the
Se le metió mucha mala fama, man. Las microtransacciones que al final prácticamente ni habían. Por no decir, no, es que no habían microtransacciones. Bueno, sí, pero era estupidez. Era como las de Team Racing Nitro Fuel que no servían para nada. Me duele decirlo, pero los que decían que Activision no le importaba Crash tenían razón. O sea, Guyus tenía razón. Has vuelto nuevo seguidor de Guyus.
The title were markedly slow out of the gate. After
Aún no estaba. Las microtransacciones estaba después. En el sexto mes.
Toys for Bob viendo que no les llegó aguinaldo ese año XD.
Ah.
just 2 weeks on the market, it was outsold in the UK by the Crash Insane trilogy.
¿Cómo? A ver.
Sales for the title were markedly slow out of the gate. After just 2 weeks on the market, it was outsold in the UK by the Crash Insane trilogy.
Pero no entiendo, o sea, sus ventas fueron malas, lo sabemos. Después de solo 2 semanas, superó las ventas de la Insane Trilogy. No, fue superado por las ventas de Reino Unido de la Insane Trilogy.
Which were released 6 years prior. By the following week.
Ah, LOL. O sea, luego de 2 semanas de su lanzamiento, en un mes en Reino Unido, en ese mes las ventas de la Insane Trilogy fueron mayores que las de Team Rumble. Pero Insane ya había salido 6 años antes. Guyus solo nos quiso mostrar la verdad. Y nosotros matamos su fangame. Perdónanos por todo, Guyus.
It had dropped out of the charts altogether. 5 days after launch, Videogamer.com reported that Rumble's viewing figures on Twitch had already dipped below 30 people.
En Twitch solamente habían 30 personas. ¡Nosotros! ¡Muchachos, ahí estamos nosotros! Los creadores de Team Rumble. ¡Estamos ahí! ¡Aparecemos! Era TDYU y otras 29 personas. ¿Quién estuvo conmigo ahí jugando las partidas locas de Team Rumble? TV famoso. ¿Dónde está ahí mi icono? Mira, además soy famoso, pucho Dios. ¿Tú jugaste conmigo en el Team Rumble? Éramos de los que más teníamos, ¿no? en el Team Rumble. Bueno, sí, porque no había nadie más. Casi nadie. ¡Ta madre! Éramos muy poquitos.
A figure they used to brand the game as dead on arrival. TrueTrophies.com was another source for the game's underwhelming metrics. Their data indicated that during launch week, its PS5 player count was 69% lower than a 2-year-old Peppa Pig game.
¿Cómo que?
Puede. Aparezco en la portada.
Luego de algunas semanas, en PlayStation 5 tenía 69% menos jugadores que Peppa Pig. Un juego de Peppa Pig de hace 2 años. Peppa Pig papeando al Rumble, chicos. La cerdita demostró. Y no nuestro Crashito.
It then hemorrhaged active players in the
Sale a jugarlo.
subsequent weeks, dropping out of the top 200 most played games on the PlayStation Network within its first month on sale. After having been in the works on and off since 2017, Crash Team Rumble arrived late to a live service trend in the games industry. The market for games like this had become largely consolidated into a handful of heavy hitters like Fortnite and Call of Duty, and in 2023 carving out an audience in this competitive field was becoming increasingly difficult. In the months leading up to Rumble's release, numerous live service titles were discontinued, including Marvel's Avengers, Babylon's Fall, Crossfire X,
Muchos juegos de online caídos. Ahora también tienen Rumble.
Knockout City, and Rumbleverse.
Otro Rumble, ese es copia. Ese se copió. Dios mío, que un pollo. Luego, ¿qué es esto?
All of these came to an end in the first half of 2023 alone. Crash Team Rumble, like many of these games, failed to make a dent. Shortly after its launch, I set up a survey to find out why so many people had chosen not to play it. From around 500 people, here were the most popular reasons given. 12% of people said that it was not released on their platform of choice. The game launched only on PlayStation and Xbox consoles, skipping PC and Nintendo Switch altogether. 16% of those surveyed cited concerns about the payment model, the entry-level premium price tag, and or the battle
No debieron anunciar esa mierda de los pases de batalla y del costo.
Pass and microtransactions.
Al final ni fue necesario, porque todo se conseguía jugando normal. Ah, no, si comprabas el deluxe era, ¿no? Porque el propio pase te daba la moneda para comprar el propio pase. Si terminabas el pase, que era muy fácil de completar, al menos los primeros, tenías lo suficiente para comprar el siguiente pase.
Systems.
Bueno, tenías pase y el juego costaba.
Many other more popular live service games like Overwatch 2 or Call of Duty have offered an entry-level free-to-play version, but Crash Team Rumble did not. Its cheapest version was sold for $30, and the game was heavily monetized with microtransactions within. 25% of people voted for what I would summarize as ineffective marketing or lack thereof. Many people responded by saying that they'd never even heard of the game, and a similarly large group told me that they didn't understand what it was. Even
Sí, es que Team Rumble es un juego muy raro de explicar. Y de paso el marketing fue una mierda, fue todo mal.
marketing didn't reach them or failed to convey what the game was. It debuted with a trailer that was entirely CGI, and when Activision finally did show in-game footage months later, there was no attempt to explain how the game actually worked. Audiences were told that it was a 4v4 game where you play as different Crash characters and attack one another, but that was about it. By far, the most popular reason why people didn't play it, however, was that they were not interested in playing a Crash game in this style. 40% of the people who responded indicated that they were simply not looking for an arena-style online multiplayer Crash game with live service elements, and this was something that commentators had raised the alarm about during previews.
Eso fue el mayor porcentaje, ¿eh?
Kotaku's Kenneth Shepard, for instance, said the following: I can't help but feel like, regardless of the game's merits and problems, it's facing an uphill battle because it's just not what Crash Bandicoot fans want. Crash Team Rumble already has a lot going against it in the eyes of purist Crash fans. It's not a platformer and it's not a kart racer.
Hacer el juego un MOBA, no incluir a Nintendo ni PC, cero publicidad y un juego como servicio de pago y con pase de batalla, a las mentes brillantes que se les ocurrió todo eso no deberían volver a darles empleo.
Pero es un MOBA, pero es plataformero. La verdad es que saberle plataformas te funciona en el juego. O sea, a mí me iba muy bien porque sabía de plataformas. Lo demás sí. O sea, si bien era un MOBA plataformero. Y Crash es plataformero. Samuel, saludazos. ¿Eso o era hacer otro Fall Guys? Que era hacer carreritas y ya está. Hablo del género del juego, no lo de todo lo demás. Hablo del género.
A core loop is solid.
De hecho, un género de este juego así no lo encuentras, ¿no? Más carreras. Más carreras, sí, más carreras.
But it's likely not what the average Crash fan is looking for.
El Fall Guys está menos muerto. Pero el chiste es justamente, querían innovar. Y la verdad es que a mí el género... A mí me encanta el género. A mí, ya les dije en su momento y lo sigo diciendo. A mí me divierte más que el Team Racing Nitro Fuel. Bueno, el Team Racing original está mucho mejor, eso sí. Por los ítems de mierda, principalmente. Pero no a todos les gusta este género, pues.
These days. The article also mentioned the
Ya está el tema de los pagos y esas huevadas.
potential of Crash Team Rumble going free to play in an effort to grow its player base. This was something that Activision never chose to pull the trigger on, although Toys for Bob did attempt to lure in new players in the months after launch. Starting in August 2023, they held occasional 4-day free trials where anyone could download a limited version of the game for free with a few different characters to try. They also offered double XP weekends for people with the full game. New content was periodically added, including more characters like Ripperoo and a number of experimental new modes. However, these efforts failed to move the needle in any meaningful way in terms of growing Rumble's audience. In the game's second season, they continued adding new maps and limited time modes, as well as kicking off an ongoing crossover with the Spyro.
Este fue su prime del Rumble, pero no sirvió. El modo aparte debió ser no un modo cooperativo, sino un modo de batalla entre sí. Eso hubiera sido más chévere, pero igual no estuvo nada mal. Chao, Tadeo. Adiós, ninja.
Franchise. This season introduced Spyro 2 villain Ripto as a playable character.
Bueno, ahorita que explica la historia del Rumble, básicamente. Sí, ya sabemos cómic, todo lo que tú quieras. Luego vino la furra de... Oh, también tuvo historia la Elora, eso no lo sabía. Ese cómic no lo he visto.
Recruiting him to deal with Ripto. 3 years after the cancellation of Crash Bandicoot 5, Toys for Bob was finally able to realize their Crash Spyro crossover within Crash Team Rumble.
Oh, bueno, al menos hicieron ese sueño.
Unbeknownst to many, they even hid material.
¿Qué esperas si los niños de hoy día solamente juegan shooters y tienen como entretenimiento Skibidi Toilet y G-Man? Bueno, a Fall Guys le va regularmente bien, ¿no? Pero es gratis, Fall Guys es gratis. Bueno, no empezó siendo gratis, empezó costando, pero fue gratis para el PS Plus. Y como muchos tienen el PS Plus, pues básicamente fue gratis.
Material from Crash 5 in the game. Special unlockable banners were included in the Season 3 Battle Pass, which were made from concept art created for Crash 5. This included one named Tag Team,
Ya ven,
in which Crash
ahí estaban los guiños del Crash 5, chat. Yo les dije, yo cuando vi ese arte, chat, ese arte, o está cocinando algo, o es algo que se perdió.
and Spyro can be seen adventuring together in the Beastmaker's world. In typical winking Toys
Bueno, ese salió después, yo hablé de los payasos, ¿no? Ah, no me acuerdo.
fashion, the developers were able
Lo dijiste sí, revisa el historial. Yo lo dije siempre.
to sneak in nods to a project that they were never able to bring to fruition. The studio's efforts to build excitement around Crash Team Rumble were, in the end, unsuccessful. The small spikes in engagement generated by new characters proved short-lived, and by the end of 2023 its future was looking more and more uncertain. A Nintendo Switch version of the game had been in development, but was cancelled by Activision due to the lack of interest in the other versions.
Oh, estaban haciendo la versión para Switch. No, chat. Bueno, sí, ya estaba demasiado mal. ¿Para qué darle más, no? No había forma de remontar.
In the final months of the year, Toys for Bob
Imaginan que sí. Imaginan que sí, pero no, difícil. Era hacerlo gratuito, como dije, al año, justo para Switch y para PC, y ¡boom! Puede ser. La última, ese hubiera sido el último dardo.
began to look to the future, starting work on a brand new game and mulling over plans to sunset Crash Team Rumble. According to former developers, they aimed to deliver a fourth and final season in 2024. This was set to add Nina Cortex to the roster, a character that had previously been outlined to appear in Crash 5, whose design from that project they were reusing. The developers had once done preliminary work towards more characters beyond this, like Tiny Tiger, Pinstripe, and the original male version of Entropy, but these were eventually nixed to focus on delivering Season 4. Alongside work on this, they were creating an original IP, what would have been their first in well over a decade, that was planned to use Unreal Engine 5. Hype around this new venture was growing internally as 2024 began, but the company's plans were about to be upended once again by external forces. In October 2023, Microsoft completed its acquisition of Activision Blizzard, following an extensive and tumultuous battle with regulators. They now owned one of gaming's biggest publishers, and Toys for Bob with it. From early on, developers told me there were concerns about how this seismic shift in the industry would impact them, but it wasn't until the 25th of January 2024 that the reality of the situation set in. On this day, Microsoft Gaming CEO Phil Spencer sent out an internal memo which opened as follows. It's been a little over 3 months since the Activision, Blizzard and King teams joined Microsoft. As we move forward in 2024, the leadership of Microsoft Gaming and Activision Blizzard is committed to aligning on a strategy and an execution plan with a sustainable cost structure that will support the whole of our growing business. Together we've set priorities, identified areas of overlap, and ensured that we're all aligned on the best opportunities for growth. He went on.
O sea, cortar personal, básicamente. Que se jode el puto Phil. Phil es nuestro padre, en teoría, porque él ahora es dueño de esto. Así que... vamos, Phil, revive esto. Saca un nuevo juego en 2 años, por favor. Bueno, en 3, porque quizás no esté haciendo uno ahorita. No lo hará. Confíen.
On to say that he and other members
Pero no hace nada. Pero lo tienen recién. Recién Xbox lo tiene. No ha pasado ni un año de que tiene a Crash. ¿Qué quiere? Que rusheen un juego.
of Microsoft's management had made the quote painful decision to lay off an enormous 1,900 people across Activision Blizzard, ZeniMax and other Xbox teams.
1900 despidos.
The email caused panic across their various subsidiaries as they gradually found out who among them would be affected. In my conversations with developers, they described the process as incredibly disorganized and stressful. On that day, the confusion and lack of clear communication from leadership was such that developers were contacting journalists rather than their own bosses to find out what was happening. Bloomberg's Jason Schreier, for example, tweeted the following. These Xbox layoffs are such a mess that staff across Activision Blizzard are texting me to try to find out if they might be impacted. Nearly 2,000 job cuts, and people now just have to wait around to see if they're part of the bloodbath. As the hours went by, it eventually became clear that Toys for Bob would be heavily affected by the restructuring. 35 of their developers were laid off amid this sudden shakeup. At its peak during Crash 4, the studio had employed around 180 people. They were now down to just 50.
Y 150, nada, gente, ya estaba en la deriva. Chicos.
The layoffs affected junior developers and longtime Toys for Bob veterans alike. One of the latter was lead concept artist Ron Key, who had been with the company for a decade. He had been serving as art director on their new IP in development when Microsoft's changes took hold. In the days after, I learned about many different stories of how the layoffs affected people, but here's one example that I think speaks to the scale and severity of what happened. Mayha Murthy was a designer at Toys for Bob who worked on Crash Team Rumble. One of her contributions to the game was writing humorous self-aware messages that appeared during a loading screen.
Ah, la chica de los mensajes. ¿Que dejó un easter egg para insultar a los Activision? ¿Se imaginan que la chica de los mensajes... A ver, gente, hay que leer esto con... dejó un mensaje... ¿Se imaginan? Un fact, Factivision, cuyos... siempre tuvo razón en inglés.
Some of these cheekily nodded towards the project's protracted development cycle.
Bananas and melons were dropped from the game debido a... Mejor lean lo que dice el tipo de inglés.
Project's protracted development cycle and ideas that were cut along the way. Like many others at the studio.
Toy for Bob empezó a hacer Crash 4 o Crash Team Rumble primero. Lo olvidamos, para ser honestos.
Messages that development cycle and ideas that were cut along the way. Like many others at the studio, she found out that she was losing her job from the news media rather than being told by her employers. In February 2024, Murthy got in touch with Activision looking to be reimbursed for her ticket to the 2024.
A ver, su trabajo no creo que sea solo poner textos, ¿no? Si no, contraten a mí. ¡Vamos! Aunque no sé inglés, chicos.
Game Developers Conference, an event set to take place 1 month from then. Typically, this would have been covered by Activision since she was employed there, but the sudden and unexpected layoffs left her uncertain. She was told to email Activision's accounting department with the request, and so she did. This was the response she received, which she later shared on social media. Quote, "Hello, I am sorry, but that is not something we can confirm. It would need to come from the travel department or maybe your former department. The travel department was liquidated. We are trying to find out who has taken over their tasks, but we have not been given any guidance yet." To clarify, this former employee who had been laid off emailed Activision's accountants who told her that they would not be able to help her get reimbursed and that she would need to contact the travel department. However, the entire travel department had been laid off as well, so they didn't know what to do because Activision had yet to replace the person who would have dictated what to do in this situation, since that role was also reduced. This is just a small slice of what some people were faced with in early 2024, and it serves to illustrate the bedlam that Microsoft left in their wake. The Activision Blizzard layoffs were met with intense criticism from consumers, journalists, and politicians alike. The FTC, who had tried unsuccessfully to prevent Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard, claimed that the tech giant had made false promises about how it intended to run the publisher. Microsoft had stated unequivocally in court that they intended to be hands-off in their management of Activision Blizzard and
O sea, Tito Phil no es tan bueno como parecía.
said that they would be able to operate independently. In Phil Spencer's own words, however, they had just admitted that the layoffs were implemented to eliminate areas of overlap between Microsoft and Activision Blizzard, suggesting that it was not operating independently at all. One commentator critical of the mass layoffs was game industry veteran Joseph Chivitate, who claimed that days later the publisher was already attempting to poach developers from other big companies.
Querían tapar desarrollos de otras compañías.
Chivitate, a well-connected 3D artist who had worked in the industry for around 20 years, alleged that recruiters from Activision Blizzard contacted people at places like Rockstar, attempting to hire away developers already in full-time
El único bueno en toda la industria fue Iwata TDYU Polar SAT.
Y me contraten a mí. Activision, contráteme a mí. Ahora me pueden hacer COD. Madre. No, Activision, perdóname. No, yo no dije nada. Ponen a poner los textitos de COD. Yo no soy empresario y nunca he manejado una empresa, pero hasta yo sé que lo que hizo es una pendejada. Generación de cristal. Mucho Dios. Si yo fuera presidente, gente, yo seré millonario y compraré el IP de Crash. Sí. En algún universo. en algún universo, no en este. Y lo montaré en medio baño, madre, Crash peruano, TD empresario. Hambre.
Positions. Here's what he had to say about the stories he had been hearing. Quote, Activision Blizzard would rather try to poach someone who's currently employed instead of hiring any of their talented, recently laid off former employees into the role, or transferring them instead of laying them off in the first place. Applying for jobs at Activision Blizzard is just data harvesting for them. They would rather poach someone else who's currently employed just to eventually lay them off too the next time Microsoft needs to make their stock price go up a nickel to meet their quarterly quotas. Microsoft released their quarterly earnings report 5 days after the restructuring, revealing that their gaming revenues had gone up 61%, largely due to the Activision Blizzard acquisition. Days later, Toys for Bob's headquarters in California was shuttered as part of the new cuts.
Cerraron, chicos.
While many of their staff had worked remotely in the previous few years, their vibrant tiki-themed offices had been held up as a source of pride for the company. With their HQ closed, the remaining staff switched to working remotely full-time in February 2024, a month that would bring further upheaval. Some reports at the time attempted to spin the situation in a positive light, but these claims are difficult to reconcile with the reality behind the scenes. Microsoft's overhaul of Activision Blizzard devastated Toys for Bob. Along with 40% of their workforce being abruptly laid off and their offices closed, the cost-cutting led to their new IP being discontinued and Crash Team Rumble's life support being pulled.
Ven, acaba de decir que descontinuó otra nueva propiedad que tenía. O sea, ¿está haciendo otro juego? Bueno, no sé, creo que no. Creo que entendí mal. Pero bueno, Team Rumble murió. O se refiere a Team Rumble, más bien dicho.
Rumble had started with tepid sales and never managed to recover.
¿Le pondrías más furros al Quash como a ti te gustan? Si no, mejor ni lo compres.
Aquí el chat todos son furros, ¿verdad? Es asquerosos. Hola, Mike. Gente, estamos serios. No, sí, más furrerías. Sí, tú nomás. Jamás. No me metas, yo no te veo, te lo juro. Viene ahí el Josh Asman.
Adding Spyro and other characters had done little to turn.
¿Qué dices? Si tú juegas puras cosas furras. La mayoría de juegos así de muñequitos son animales. ¿Qué puede hacer? Solo Mario. No juego Donkey Kong, chat. Ya fue.
Things around. For some perspective, let's briefly compare its Twitch viewership numbers to two other Activision Blizzard live service games active at the time. On the 12th of February 2024, over 52,000 people were watching live streams of Call of Duty Warzone.
52,000 viendo Call of Duty Warzone. ¡Wow! Algún día tendré yo 52,000 espectadores. ¡Mierda! No llegamos ni siquiera a 400 ahorita. En algún universo.
Overwatch 2 had around 58,000 viewers.
58,000 espectadores de Overwatch 2 en general.
Crash Team Rumble.
¿Team Rumble cuánto? ¡Chat! Vamos. Tienen las predicts del promedio de Team Rumble. Espectadores simultáneos. 2, 1, 7, 12, 10, 9, 1000. ¡Wow, Mijail! 1200. Espectadores simultáneos me refiero a una media, no en conjunto.
Had an average of
un promedio de
7.
7. ¡Oh! Yo estaba ahí. No, tuvo que 7. Versus 52,000. Por eso prefieren Call of Duty. Es que eran fan del bicho. Sí, es que eran fan de CR7, el Crashito. Está celebrando por su nuevo canal de YouTube. CB7. Era fan de Cristiano.
Pero Overwatch no duró mucho o no. Era el mismo juego de mierda pero con un 2 en el título.
A ver, aguante. Vamos. Les predecimos. A ver. Call of Duty Warzone. ¿Dónde está el juego? 32,000 espectadores. Mierda. Igual, menos que lo que mostré en el video, pero potente igual, ¿ah? Overwatch 2. 45,000. Mucho más que el Warzone. Vean, sorprendentemente, ¿no? ¡Locura! Y ahora veamos al GOAT. Al Crashito Rumble. ¿Dónde está? Ni siquiera sale. ¡Yes! ¡Hay dos! ¡Hay dos! ¿Por qué hay dos? Madu carreando. 0, el principal. El Rumble fue bonito mientras duró. Ahora clips. Vean, gente. Gente, ¿quién tiene el clip más popular? ¿Se imaginan que yo? No tengo clip más popular. De hecho, ni aparezco. Soy una basura, gente. Soy una basura. ¿Dónde estoy yo? ¿Y yo? ¿No tuve ningún clip? Literalmente popular? Yo no aporté nada. No fui yo entonces. ¿Oye, yo? ¿No tengo ningún clip? ¿Ningún clip? Ahí está el Craddock. ¿Ningún clip del Rumble del TDYU? Porque yo no streameas, pero he puesto total, he puesto más populares de todo el tiempo. Qué raro, ¿no? O sea, al menos uno, ¿no? Yo no streamé Team Rumble, nunca pasó.
Aquel que dijo que Overwatch es una mierda se me retracta porque por su culpa me resuscribí a este horrible canal con olor a basura por 7ª vez consecutiva solo para responderle. O sea, igual lo iba a hacer porque me gusta la basura, pero te condeno.
Gracias, supongo. ¿Qué le pasa? ¿Qué fue? Oye, ¿y dónde está el TDYU? No tuve ninguno. Ningún clip. Siquiera con una vez.
Overwatch 2 tiene 40.000. No está tan muerto como pensaba XD. Igual hay gente mirando solo por ser un juego jugado por muchas mujeres, usualmente Mercy, y ahí están los simp, sons mirando.
No, Overwatch 2 tiene su gente. De hecho, tiene más que Warzone. Así que al final el juego está súper vivo. No como Rumble. Ah, y el Team Racing, chat, el Nitro Fuel, 23.
Furros y basura, lo mejor de este canal, sobre todo los furros.
¡Hay furros! Bueno, ustedes puede ser, pero yo no. 23 chicos, ahí carreando. Masco, Gringo, Crepiluca, Clear Aster. Más que el Rumble. En el Nitro Fuel sí apareceré, ¿no? No sé. Solo quiero aparecer una vez. ¿Dónde estoy? No hay nadie. Propuse bascular. Ah, de 24 horas, sí, tarado. Una vez aparezco. Una vez. ¿Por qué? Pero ¿estoy shadowbaneado o qué? ¿No tengo ningún clip? O es que, bueno, es que estamos más abajo. Una vez ya es ganancia. Una vez. No pido mucho. ¿No tenemos ningún clip chat? ¿Con 20 visitas siquiera? Solo uno. No, chicos. Nada que ver. F por el TDYU. Nunca lo jugué. ¿Quién conoce al TDYU? TDYU en decadencia. Me parece raro que no aparezca siquiera uno, man. Pi. ¿Tú quién eres? Se ve invisible.
Mijail, ¿dónde están los clips?
Les puso mal la categoría. No, Mijail estaba cuando estábamos en Team Resident Evil Fuel. ¡No se burlen!
¿Quién te ubica?
¿Cómo lo dijo el Loquendo, no?
As a result, plans for a 4th and last season were scrapped. It was around just over 1 month away from being ready at the time the call was made. With support.
Fallaste a la comunidad del Crashito como creador de contenido.
Pero yo sí tengo clips. ¿Por qué no aparecen? Debería buscar mis clips y ver cuántas visitas tienen, ¿verdad? Creo que no aparecen. A ver, lo voy a buscar yo aquí. De hecho, lo puedo filtrar. Un clip con 20 visitas debo tener seguro, man. A ver, vamos a chequear, chicos. Ponemos clips, buscar por categoría Crash Team Rumble. Pau. A ver. El máximo de visitas de mis clips de Team Rumble, que veo que sí tengo. Tengo uno. Este es mi mejor clip, en serio. Bueno, el clip más famoso que tengo de Team Rumble es este llamado Un Gordo. No sé cómo mostrarlo, porque este es Brave, ¿no? Y este es Google. No lo puedo poner. Compartir, si no. Tiene enlace. A ver. Muchachos, ¿qué es eso? Un gordo. Adiós, gordo. Es mi mejor clip, chicos. Vaya. Pero este clip tiene 137 visualizaciones. ¿No salió antes? ¿O fuimos ciegos? Grande Imanol por el clip. Muchas gracias, Imanol. Y ya. Ahí está el clip. Dios mío. Parece una dota. Oye, te ayudo. Después puedes preguntar al chat para que den su opinión. Hace meses dejé de jugar LOLcito. Bien hecho. No debes regresar a LOL. Quédate sin jugar LOL de Kasharik. Cristo, saludazos.
Support for the project now gone, developers hastily reworked some of what they had finished, like unreleased cosmetics, as part of a final free battle pass.
Bueno, en resumen, al final, antes de que se muriera ya la llamada final para decir Team Rumble se muere, pusieron el pase gratuito con todos los elementos que tenían restantes.
The game was set up to end on a whimper compared to the bang they had once hoped to go out on. As the dust was settling, Toys for Bob's heads entered discussions with Microsoft to go independent. The studio had been a part of the Activision umbrella for nearly 2 decades, and had seen its share of highs and lows since then. With fresh leadership overseeing Activision Blizzard, they took the opportunity to renegotiate the terms of their relationship and were successful. Microsoft granted them their independence and a fresh start. On the 28th of February 2024, the company's future plans...
Pero Toys for Bob ahora no pertenece ni a Microsoft ni a Activision, son independientes. Ahora, ¿qué harán con la independencia? Ya nadie les puede decir qué hacer.
Hola, causa.
Pero no tienen las IPs de Crash y Spyro. Hola, Nitsu.
revealed to the public via a blog entry on their website. Quote, "We're thrilled to announce that Toys for Bob is spinning off as an independent game development studio. This opportunity allows us to return to our roots of being a small and nimble studio." In that same post, they announced that they were exploring a potential partnership with Microsoft on a new
Estaban explorando una posible asociación con Microsoft. O sea, básicamente solo un IP de ellos.
project. Less than an hour later, the fate of
Pues espero.
Crash Team Rumble was officially confirmed when a message quietly appeared in the game's home menu. It stated that March 4th, 2024 would mark its final content update, although the game would continue to be
La muerte del Rumble, chicos.
playable. Microtransactions were being discontinued, and a free 500-tier battle pass was to be made available for all users, which had unlockables from previous seasons and 104 new items made up of content once planned for future updates. It even included an unlockable Season 4 icon in memory of the final season that they were prevented from finishing. The end of Crash Team Rumble was noticeably unceremonious. Outside of this single, concisely worded message, neither Toys for Bob or Activision chose to acknowledge it on any of their official channels. No eulogies from the development team, no mentions of it on social media,
Fue como el patito feo. Nadie. Lo trataron mal desde el principio.
or even their official
No, desde antes.
website. This would lead to some confusion among fans who hadn't seen the easily missed in-game message that would later vanish altogether. For context, Toys for Bob had routinely made posts about their in-game events on sites like Twitter and Facebook in the months prior. Even when the game made a bevy of content free for users on March 4th, all parties remained quiet on it. It was clear that the project was something that they had chosen to move on from. In the end, the studio managed to weather this storm under an embattled Activision Blizzard. They entered a new era of independence, setting their sights on a partnership with Microsoft. Over the previous several years, they had gradually lost a lot of their workers, their headquarters, and suffered multiple cancellations along the way. This was the outcome of a parent company in crisis that had lost faith in traditional single-player games, struggling to find a place for Toys for Bob in their pivot towards the games-as-a-service model. Activision originally purchased the company at a time when its speciality was making middle-tier budget platformers. Despite how successful their single-player games continue to be, the publisher had Toys for Bob move away from what they had been built to do in order to supplement their drive for live service content. This disconnected, one-size-fits-all management style led to a slump in morale, developers leaving, and eventually an online-only Crash game that audiences rejected. Consider also the fact that in the almost 20 years that Activision owned Toys for Bob, they were only ever allowed to ship one original IP, and it was the most successful endeavour they ever embarked upon together. After squeezing every last penny out of Skylanders, Activision then refused to ever again take a gamble on any new property they wanted to attempt, as they became increasingly averse to risk. Even a Crash Bandicoot cross-spiral platformer was deemed too big of a leap.
En fin, chicos. Bueno, Toy for Bob estaba siempre destinado... Bueno, siempre hizo juegos plataformeros 3D. Y cuando fallaron en la última, pues bueno, pasaron a COD a la fuerza. Ni siquiera un nuevo Crash ambicioso, ese crossover, fue suficiente para que Activision volviera a confiar. COD quiere a lo seguro. Bueno, Activision quiere lo seguro que es con COD. En fin, chicos.